So in this lecture, we're really just focusing on the causes of World War II. Military battles are really not going to be part of the AP test, and so we're just going to be focusing on the cause and effect of World War II, part of how it, leads into and escalates into a full-on world war. We'll explore that as well. That is what we call the course or the road to war. But for the most part, we're looking at kind of the buildup coming from the totalitarian governments and the rise of fascism and communism clashing with these struggling democratic states. Okay, so just as a reminder of where we are, because of the end of World War I and leading into European society going through depression, going through disillusionment. Everything is not stable still, and so the rise of totalitarianism comes, and you have the dictators that take power. People, publicly accept them because they're desperate for change, and eventually the amount of aggression will lead us into World War. It's all tied together, right? So it's all kind of one direction, one movement. And then going into after this is going to be the Cold War, which is really a continuation of the desire for influence over unstable nations. Okay. All right. So the causes, to really just hit the main points, is that since the end of the Great War in World War I, Europe was unable to maintain peace. They failed to have what we call collective security be enforced throughout the world. And so mainly the organization of the League of Nations we talked about at the end of World War I was responsible for this. And because of the failure of this, we're going to see that this is what it will lead to World War II. Okay, so this is kind of like the main idea we need to take away. Right, so here are the factors contributing to the failure of collective security. First, starting off with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and because the terms were considered, harsh peace, diktat, and taking the war guilt clause and taking the amount of reparations, and just the effect and the burden has put on the losers of World War I. We talked about this many times, right? The frustration and the bitterness that is growing and the resentment towards other nations, that is used as propaganda, right? That is used as a fuel for the fire, and that is going to cause the justification to retaliate because of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so the League of Nations, its purpose was to maintain peace, and two key nations that were not part of the League of Nations is the United States and the Soviet Union. At that point, the League of Nations pretty much will kind of have its hands tied behind its back, not being able to stop the aggressive countries like Germany and Italy, and constantly peace treaty violations will ensue. And because people are violating these treaties, right, there should be countries to step in to do so, and they said, the League of Nations, that's their job now, but the League of Nations does not enforce, does not act, does not have really the military backing or even capabilities to go out and police the world. Okay, after World War I, also there were some other agreements made and signed, and these pacts, right, these agreements came through the 1920s, and each one, right, so the Locarno Pact basically decided that European nations are going to work through peaceful diplomacy as opposed to violence and aggression. And so any type of conflicts or disputes, they'll have to, discuss it politically and have diplomatic meetings. This is kind of like more of an empty promise, because many Europeans believed that this Locarno Pact would actually do something, but actually it was not enforceable. Right? The League of Nations never really used the Locarno Pact to stop any of these aggressors from making their moves. And so even with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, this is where the nations in 1928 signed a treaty saying that if we go to war, it can only be for defensive purposes, meaning another country is going to attack me first. War, for the most part, is then going to be illegal at that point. For me to start a war, for me to attack another nation, it's going to be illegal. We're not going to allow it. So on paper, it sounds good. On paper, it seems like war is something that we have accepted we're not going to even pursue, right? After World War I, that great war, the war to end all wars, like we don't even want to be a part of that. And that was what, perception was. But because of the lack of enforcement, it really was just paper, right? It was nothing more than just empty promises. All right, the factor of the Great Depression as well, we talked about this many times, just to add it all in together. So we're really looking at all these factors, right, contributing to ultimately the inability to maintain peace after World War I. The Great Depression was obviously detrimental to many of the European societies and economies. However, Hitler, just realized that, Germany had to really pick itself up, through its own efforts. There wasn't a real aid or dependency that allowed Germany to see that the other nations are helping them, right? In fact, they felt like even more betrayed because of the constant interest rates and loans that they had to pay back, to the point where they're, in remarkable debt. And so there is no, organization that seems to be, actually genuinely helping Germany. And so Hitler felt that the international crises with the economy and all of that, right, had to be resolved within each country, and he recognized that. Okay, and so he accomplished that by just, funding the war machine through putting people back to work. Okay, all right. The other factor is the rise of aggression, and so the amount of invasions in the 1930s is just really amazing, knowing that this is what countries were trying to avoid, but they were more tolerant of it. And we're going to talk about appeasement in the next slide, but with each and every invasion, it almost seems like, oh, well, just a little bit more, right? Just a little bit more. And all of these power-hungry, land-hungry, glory-hungry leaders are becoming even more militaristic, right, and expressing that, right? So first, I'm going to go over a few of these, right? First is going to be Japan invading Manchuria in 1931. So I don't have a map, but we're not going to be covering Asia too much because this is AP Euro. Japan, right, invades China. Manchuria is northern China, right above Korea. Eventually, in 1935, Italy is going to invade Ethiopia. Okay, they're looking to take their own, right, seizure of these colonies, and so Italy takes it over. Originally, Ethiopia defended itself, right, but now Italy is going to take it over, and so with Mussolini, the League of Nations never really did anything. There was no enforcement, and because of this is an example. Mussolini feels like, hey, I'm on top, I'm unstoppable, right? League of Nations not stopping me about this. Okay, the next event in the 1930s is going to be Germany occupying the Rhineland. So remember, the Rhineland was the demilitarized zone. This is breaking the Treaty of Versailles. Essentially, Hitler believes that France and Britain have not stopped me. I mean, I clearly broke the Treaty of Versailles. It's not like, yeah, he kind of did. I'm not quite sure. It's kind of disputable. It depends on how you see it. No, it's very clear that it's a demilitarized zone. Military troops are in there. Military arms are in there. He clearly broke it. But Hitler says, like, hey, like, they don't want to start with us, then great. We're going to continue moving forward, okay? So I'll talk more about this during appeasement time, but let's continue. Japan is going to invade China even further, right? And it's going to go more south. Going to go through Beijing. It's going to go through Nanking, the rape of Nanking. Very, very, really important event that many Chinese still recognize as a great atrocity, right? Where hundreds of thousands were massacred, civilians even, which is, breaking the rules of war. Also, tens of thousands of women are raped, and that is something that Japan is part of the history that sometimes Japan hasn't completely confessed to, and even Shanghai going that far down along the coast of China. Okay, all right. So those are kind of the main ones of the 1930s as far as invasions. There's a few more that I'll cover in the next slide, but one of the main examples I do wanted to bring up, which will be on the AP test, is the Spanish Civil War. Okay, so the Spanish Civil War is plainly, right, socialism and communism vying for power against the right-wing conservatives. Okay, so Francisco Franco is going to be the guy in the bottom right-hand corner. He decides to side with the conservative right-wing fascists, and so because he's in charge of some military leaders, he believes that the socialists are trying to take over and control Spain, and so he is going to work with the right-wing conservative, meaning the Catholic Church and also the upper class, in order to take down the socialists from making Spain a communist country. And so with the fighting, those that were fighting for the socialist side will not just have to face Franco, but also have to face Mussolini and Hitler. And so Franco had a lot of support from his fascist buddies, and Italy sent 100,000 troops. Germany, with the Nazis, sent the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and at this point, it's going to be a very bloody civil war. Okay, 600,000 troops will, 600,000 Spanish troops, civilians I think included, right, will be killed, and even innocent civilians of their own people, Franco would not spare, and so the Luftwaffe even bombed the famous city of Guernica. It's really like a more of a village, as far as what I'm aware, but if you remember from the Age of Anxiety lecture, this is what Picasso painted in that kind of really obscure kind of solemn piece. Okay, so the Spanish Civil War in the end, right, is where Franco wins, and the dictatorship of a fascist nation is now under Franco's rule, and this is where Franco is going to try to maintain his own country throughout World War II. He's going to be, for the most part, neutral, but he's still fascist, right? So he's not going to be a target for Hitler, Mussolini to take down because they see him as an ally. This is showing, right, the Spanish Civil War is more like a sub-example, a smaller example, of essentially the greater conflict between fascism and communism clashing together, and fascists willing to work together in order to suppress, because communism and socialism is very left-wing, whereas fascism is very right-wing. Okay, all right. So let's go over the conquest. So the conquest of Germany, very simply, comes through two routes. Right. Really, one is that Germany does not need to really lift a finger. They essentially just put on a threat, a military threat, and countries give in. Okay. So the first one is going to be Austria. Because Germany went through a massive time of rearmament and funding that war machine and rebuilding its army and all that kind of stuff under the Nazis, this allowed them to recover from economic depression and now become a threat. And so because Hitler threatened Austria that they will just march, invade, and annex Austria, they could either go with Hitler's plans and work with Germany, or they will be taken over. So it's kind of your pick, which one, right? So why does Hitler even want this territory? Well, one, land is important, right? Two, it's on the border of Germany, right? They share borders, but also, okay, taking this into account, there are millions of German people that live in Austria, and they speak German, and their culture is German. And so he believes in Lebensraum, right? He believes that the Aryan race should populate, it should continue, and those are our people. Those are our, of our blood. So our empire will grow one country at a time. Okay, so starting with Anschluss, which is the union between Austria and Germany, the Austrian government just gives in, and so the Austrian Nazi Party, right, takes over Austria, and at that point, Hitler sends in his troops, and they just unite as one, right? So it's just now the German Empire. The other Allied powers are just kind of sitting around twiddling their thumbs. I mean, they're very aware of what's going on, but they don't want to pick a fight. Okay, so this is into the 30s, the late 30s, and World War II is about to begin. However, Chamberlain, who's the prime minister in Britain at this point, is very reluctant to really threatening Hitler from doing anything because he doesn't feel like they're ready yet. Okay. All right, so the next event is going to be Czechoslovakia, okay, specifically the territory of Sudetenland. Forgot a map, but I'm going to talk about it in the next slide because I do have a map in that one. But Sudetenland is basically just a very thin strip of land that is on the outside border of Czechoslovakia. And the reason why the Sudetenland is so important to Hitler is because, once again, there are German-speaking people there. Also, there's natural resources that are useful, coal that is, something that Germany can definitely use to modernize, industrialize. Okay. What it came down to is Czechoslovakia obviously does not want to give up their land. They are one of the remaining Eastern European countries that are democratic, that are somewhat modernized, and so what it comes down to is that Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, these four powers, meet together in 1938 called the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference discussed whether or not Czechoslovakia will give up land or will they not, right? And so, for one thing, Czechoslovakia, this is their own land. They're not in this meeting, right? And so Neville Chamberlain is the prime minister, as I said, and he says, you know what, why don't we just give Hitler the Sudetenland? This will be the last agreed demand that we'll give into. Not that Chamberlain is Hitler's friend, not that Chamberlain agrees with this like completely, but he realizes, you know what, like this is where we draw the line. We will give Hitler the Sudetenland, and he can't have anything else. Okay, and so Hitler says, okay, well, I agree. So without lifting a finger, once again, the Nazis have acquired more territory. Okay, just because they have shown aggression. So the concept of appeasement is really important. It's going to be in the AP test. Okay, appeasement is where countries will make concessions or agreements to meet the demands of the aggressor. So if an aggressor like Italy or Germany or Japan, okay, says, I want this, okay, other countries are willing to say, okay, I'll give it to you, however, like you cannot, right, continue after this, right? So they think that they're kind of like in control, but in reality, the aggressor is always the one that is in control, right? So in order to maintain peace, this is what many of the Western powers agreed to, right? France and Britain obviously agreed to this. Now, their reasonings before it is for several reasons. One, they obviously do not want to have another world war. They saw how bad World War I was. Let's not repeat that. Secondly, we don't want communism to continue in many of these countries. So instead of preventing, or in order to prevent communism from taking over, well, we're okay with these fascist dictatorships to some extent. Okay. Lastly, is that they don't have the budget or preparations to really go to World War again. Right? They didn't fund their military. They're not building up their military as aggressively as Hitler does, and that's why Hitler, up to 1941, and the Nazis are going to be completely dominant of Europe. Okay. All right. So the Czechs felt betrayed because they lost that land, that Sudetenland, and Hitler says, oh, like, after this, I'm done, right? But what ends up happening is, several months later, Germany is going to just march in and occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. And so Hitler basically broke his promise. He lied about it, and he backstabbed Czechoslovakia, and betrayed his words to Chamberlain. Okay. All right, so then it brings us to the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. This is where Hitler wanted to avoid a two-front war. He did not want to fight France and Britain on one side and Russia on the other side as World War I happened. Right, that was a geographical disadvantage, and so Stalin, right, doesn't like Hitler. Right, they both don't like each other because their values are very opposite. Right, left wing, right wing, and so they actually made this agreement for the reason being that they secretly said that we'll both invade Poland, we'll split it in half, and then we'll, each get our own territories, and we can deal with that. And so that was kind of the behind-the-scenes ulterior motive, right? However, like what was known to the public is they're saying, all right, we're going to promise each other a peace of non-aggression for 10 years, but really it lasted for a few months. Okay, then comes the beginning of World War II. So the official beginning of World War II comes through this date, and it's the invasion of Poland. So the event where Poland is attacked, Germany basically just sends in its air force, right? It begins bombing, and this will lead us into explaining what Blitzkrieg is, right? So Blitzkrieg is lightning war in German, and so you should be pretty familiar with all these terms because of world history. But 2 days later, after Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, on September 3rd, Britain and France then said, okay, well, we had to declare war now because Hitler obviously did not even declare war on Poland, and he just marched in, he just attacked. And at this point, the German Air Force, the German tanks and troops will continue to push forward. And so what is different with Blitzkrieg and significant about it is that it's very fast-paced, right? Lightning strikes fast, hits hard, whereas the trench warfare was long and slow process. It was the war of attrition. Okay, so that's a big difference, right? It's a lot of mobility and advancement versus kind of a stalemate and stagnant situation. So Blitzkrieg, all you need to take away is that Poland was defeated very quickly because the coordinating of these military attacks are very strategic in the sense where you just hit the enemy as quickly as possible, then you take out its supply lines, its reinforcement lines, and you make it impossible for them to resupply the front line because you blow up their railroads, right? You blow up their main roads of transportation, so they cannot access, and then basically all the units are separated and isolated. And so as the constant pounding of artillery and bombs and sending in troops, they stand no match, okay? Countries really stand no match. So it brings me to my example, which is here. As you can see, by 1941, okay, all of this territory is going to be controlled by the Nazis. Okay, as you can see, that's pretty much what we would say like 3/4 of Europe, as much as what Napoleon took over. And so all of Western Europe is taken over, including France. Switzerland and Sweden are neutral at this point. Spain allowed Germany to use its ports, even though it's neutral. They're on the side of the fascists. They're not really fighting, though. And so up to this point, there really is no opposition. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about what will happen with the Allied powers and how they would respond to basically Hitler getting whatever he wants and taking over all of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and most of Western Europe, except for Britain. Okay. Really quickly, the Sudetenland is on the border, on the outside border. It's a very thin layer. I don't know if I can do it from here. Let's see. All right, so it's a very thin layer along this part of Czechoslovakia on the outside border. Okay. Sorry, I didn't pull out my pen or anything, but that is where the main German population is, which makes sense because that's right on the border of where Germany and Czechoslovakia are. Okay, all right. The next map I need to show you guys is about the Holocaust, and we're very familiar with the Holocaust. I don't need to go too in detail, but coming from the anti-Semitic laws from Kristallnacht, putting them to Jewish ghettos, it's really building, compounding, and the discrimination is growing progressively, and eventually the Holocaust breaks off into what we call the final solution, which was the complete execution of the Jewish population decided by the Nazis. Okay, so we have a few things like on this map. Specifically, we have the death camps, the extermination camps. Then we have the concentration camps throughout Europe, and then we also have the Jewish ghettos. Okay, so the Jewish ghettos are the ones with the Star of David, the yellow stars. Then we have the black square cities and towns, right? So you can see throughout Germany, throughout parts of the Balkans, and definitely in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of concentration camps, and then even death camps, even the most in total in Poland, and that's where the Jews were shipped out and they were basically killed. And so how this will play out is post-World War II, right? The Jewish people felt that with their persecution and discrimination, right, since at the beginning of time, they feel like they need their own homeland, right? So nationalism will come through the Zionists, and then they'll have their own state eventually. Okay.